Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 21st of December and today's update is very important because we're looking at developments south of Pokrovsk, but the main focus of the video will be on Toretsk as I promised in yesterday's video. And really we're looking at updates from the past 24 hours, but also over the past fortnight because in recent videos I've not really covered it. I haven't had the time to collect information and look in granular detail at the structures in the areas where the Russians were advancing through block by block, but there really are some significant gains that have accumulated throughout the month of December. And we're also going to look at the bigger picture, how these advances will then affect the nearby regions north of New York and Konstantinivka. So that's going to be very interesting. We'll also look at Kursk and some other news relating to Ukrainian units being rotated and some drama relating to the 155th Mechanized Brigade. But let's zoom in over here first south of Pokrovsk. You can see just slight Russian gain amounting to 0.5 square kilometers, leading to the Russian entrance into the village of Pischane, an area where you did have a strong Ukrainian accumulation of forces really sent in to hold on to a buffer zone of fields in between this highway connecting Toretsk and Shevchenko, and then moving northwards. The field itself spans about 3 kilometers vertically before reaching Pischane. So for about a week, there was just back and forth in this area where you had like the 33rd Assault Battalion or whatever elements are left of the 155th Mechanized Brigade as a unified body, counterattacking on a local level, and then utilizing some of their more advanced Western weaponry to do so, including a lot of armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles as well, and holding off the Pischane. In the process, now we're seeing the Russians begin to consolidate south of Pischane and begin the first infiltrations into the village. So this is from December 20th. This is from the 425th Scala Battalion. If you recall, they previously did have a very strong presence and were able to achieve a lot of localized achievements, you could say. A lot of really important, sort of shaping operations to improve local defensive positions in areas near this Terrakon, north of Novohordivka, west of some of these trench lines. So the Skala battalion was moved a couple of kilometers westwards to engage with the defensive activities of Pokrovsk and Shevchenko. And this is being done in conjunction with the 59th Brigade, which has a tank battalion specifically being deployed in this area because the rest of the brigade is mainly situated southwards in areas near Novo-Olenivka, Ukrainka, generally, you could say west or northwest of Sonsivka. But just to recalibrate for a second, you guys can see that in this video, you had a squad from the Skala Battalion dismount in one of the southernmost streets of Pischane. They attacked a Russian grouping that had entrenched themselves in one of the houses there, doing so with support from drones dropping grenades. And at the end, you could see how the Russian troops withdraw from that location, indicating a successful counterattack. But also, it shows us that the Russians are now actively operating here and they are making really this effort to get foothold here, push out the Ukrainians permanently. And from there, the goal would be to branch out along a very specific path because there is this paved road that then runs northwards into Zvirove and then into Leontovichi. And from there, you reach the sort of southwestern rear of Pokrovsk, an area that, if you go back a couple of months, really the Ukrainians would not have imagined that they would have to defend from this location because let's say you go back 4 or 5 months, the Russian momentum was really situated around Novohordivka during those southern summer months, also Hrodivka. And since then, they moved in a significant amount of reinforcements, including at least 2,000 from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade to stabilize his situation in these urban battles. And since then, the lines have not changed that much. The issue is in Saidov, there never was a similar stabilization. The Russians were able to overwhelm the Ukrainian defenses over there, take over the city largely intact. You didn't see that much fighting, especially in the western portion of the city. And then from there, just continue to capitalize, hopping from village to village, with the Ukrainians unable to fall back to a decent line, a line that's, is good when it comes to logistics, where the flanks aren't threatened, where you actually do have static defenses that were prepared beforehand, an area where all the units can, actively collaborate and communicate with one another in an efficient manner. None of that was ever achieved. And that just continued sort of piling up until the Russians were able to advance along this rail line axis all the way to Shevchenko. And that's when you reach already larger villages, not just small hamlets, but you're reaching these sort of medium-sized settlements, which have a strategic value, they have logistic value, And so now the Russians are in control of a lot of these road junctions, which will allow them to, fester through the final lines of static defenses that the Ukrainians have south of Pokrovsk, and then actually reach the outskirts of the city from an area that really wasn't envisaged a couple of months ago. That would be at the forefront of the heavy fighting in this location. And so the Ukrainians, as a result, have had to very quickly change their defensive policy, redeploy troops. So we're just seeing that, and it has started to unfold over the past couple of months. And now the pace is beginning to uptake when it comes to redeployments to this region. So notably, you have reserve rifle brigades moved into this region. You have the 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. We've also mentioned this before, but a bunch of other smaller units that are specialized and have a lot of Western training or equipment located in this region. Have experience in active defense, not just in holding on to trenches, but then pushing and punching above their weights, trying to take back areas that the Russians were advancing through. So that's a part of what the Ukrainians are doing to try to stabilize the situation. But even if they do at this point, get some sort of temporary measure where the Russians aren't able to penetrate deeper, the Russians are now going to be able to move their forward artillery and these short range mortars to higher elevated areas in some cases. Although, to be fair to the Ukrainians, the elevation in this region, starting in Shevchenko all the way to like the Pokrovsk center, is on pretty high ground. So the Ukrainians do have, pretty good positions that overlook the surrounding regions. But even that has not been enough to stop the Russian attacks. Regardless, though, the Russians will be able to move artillery and mortars really to a close range and fire into the city center and also along the E50 highway, which comes in from Dnipro Oblast, goes all the way to areas like Pavlohrad, and then can feed into the city itself. And that's going to make it much more difficult to resupply this city and Myrnograd in the long term. So that's just a concern that the Ukrainians really have to attend to as the battle here really heats up and approaches the center itself. That's going to be a big fear. And at the forefront of this defense is the 155th Mechanized Brigade. This unit was trained in France throughout the summer months, and it had, I believe, 3 changes in command within like half a year of being formed. So that's just crazy when you think about it. But now it seems that they have received new leadership for the 3rd time. I think that happened a couple of weeks ago. The issue is, and this is being reported on by French media, is that it had 2,500 men, most of them, of course, being ground soldiers that have frontline roles. But once they made it back from their training in France and became registered as an official unit deployed at the front line, especially in this region over here, south of Pokrovsk, they were sort of split up, and that didn't ever act as a unified body. Each brigade that was already established, they took and sort of peeled off whatever parts of this brigade they needed for specific needs. So, for instance, there is the anti-air battalion of this unit, which was created and has, for instance, like Stinger missiles and similar sort of equipment that was supplied from Western partners. And so those operators, they were taken away from the brigade and deployed to other units nearby. And so now the anti-tank, anti-air battalion and some of the ATGM operators have just been completely dissipated from this unit and were just redeployed because what's being said by a lot of the local commanders is that there was never a need for a new brigade in this region in the first place. And the manpower, especially specialized manpower, was needed to fill up the ranks of brigades where there are already, a lack of full capacity. So you really need to fill up that capacity to the brim. And then the issue is when you create a new brigade, even though you're getting 2,500 new men recruited, a lot of them have to be staff, and so then the staff and officer component becomes overbloated, and it's not necessary because you already have enough officers in all the other units. But what they do need are the regular, operators, people who are fighting on the day-to-day in trenches, and then some of the people that have specialized knowledge in drones or ATGMs or whatever it may be. And the thing about drones is that apparently this unit never actually received drones along with its package from the French, because the French didn't supply them with the vast majority of their equipment. I think they also got 30 Leopard 2A4s from Poland, but they never received, electronic warfare systems or just a large, sizable chunk of drones. And that's absolutely crucial in a battle like this. It's crucial anywhere in Ukraine, but especially here. They did receive armored vehicles like the AMXs or the VABs, as they got Caesars or 120 millimeter mortars. So those are, of course, all good. But just the backbone of the unit has to be drones. There has to be drones involved, as you have with every other unit in this area. So that would also take away from the efficacy of the units. And so once they're returned, it was sort of just split up, and it was described as sort of like an organ donation, where each unit just took away what they needed from the elements from the 155th Brigade. And so now there's questions about how much of the units actually still exist and is fighting as a unified force, as opposed to just receiving training in France and then being sort of dispersed into other units in the area. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And of course, we'll see what the Ukrainian command has to say about this, because I don't think they've commented yet specifically on the story. Now moving on to Toretsk, we're going to zoom in over here. And before we get into the nitty gritty, I want to show you guys that the 150th Mechanized Brigade has now officially joined the 30th Marine Corps. That's what it's called. And that includes all four Marine brigades. It also includes the Birds of Magyar Regiment, which recently was changed from just a drone unit to an entire sized regiment, and it's attached to the Marines, of course. Recently, the Marines really have been revamped. They spent a year after the counteroffensive operating in Kherson, which was, again, besides the one brigade that really fought in the Krinky pockets, it was lower intensity fighting. And so they had time to rebuild in that period, and now they're being redeployed in full force, either to the Pokrovsk front or south of it, or to the Kursk region. So they're really making their presence known and of importance to the wider Ukrainian defense in this region. So now the 150th Mechanized Brigade is being, integrated into the Marine Corps family, and that's in addition to the 124th and 126th Territorial Defense Brigades, which have also been integrated. I really don't know why those units were. Again, maybe it has something to do with the sort of battalions, the makeup of the battalions in these units, or some sort of specialized equipment that they received. But also, they're not operating in the same parts of the front line. So I don't know if this is just sort of laying the framework for future deployments of units. But right now, there isn't really any significance to them being added to the same corps, because for instance, this brigade is not fighting in Pokrovsk or Kursk. It's been one of the main units defending in the Toretsk area, and actually, according to Military Land.net, it has suffered some of the heaviest casualties in the battles over here. So hopefully we get some more elaboration on what's going on with this unit. It's a relatively new one. It was created in October of 2023, and again, just received a lot of specialized Western equipment during that time period. But now to zoom in, I want to begin with the area north of Nelipivka. You can see here the Russians took over a total of 3.3 square kilometers. And, this is over a larger period of time, because I haven't been keeping up with this area on a day-to-day basis. I just sort of left it since the beginning of December. And now I'm going back to see what's verified based on recent geolocated data. Because an issue with the mapping in Elipivka is that the Russians, for a really long time now, have been able to find weak points along the rail line or in fields to the west of it, and then send in armored columns, push through into the center of Leonidivka, dismount forces. But then after a couple of days, you never receive additional elaboration as to whether the Russians were successful or any sort of confirmation of their status within the village. So after a couple of days, you begin to deduce that probably the Russians were pushed back by the Ukrainians. But this time it is a bit of an exception, because the Ukrainian sources are now sort of acknowledging it on their own. And there's multiple pieces of evidence backing up the fact that the Russians are located in the northern parts of Nelipivka and may be located even deeper into areas in eastern Leonidivka. So that's something to keep an eye out for. But definitely the Russians have been able to treat the Ukrainians in this area after just months of constantly launching these sort of armored attacks, and most of the vectors were repelled. Eventually, the Russians were able to sort of hit a critical mass and break through in this location. So you can see this is from the 5th National Guard Brigade. This unit previously operated in the Lipsy sector, but it was recently redeployed to here, which is important because definitely the Ukrainians needed that after just months of the same stock of units operating here. The Ukrainian force north of New York really was aided by the 12th Special Purpose Brigade, but that was not enough. It was working in tandem with the 101st TDF Brigade and 53rd Mechanized Brigade. Now it's also going to receive the assistance of the 5th National Guard Operational Brigade. So you could see here how that unit destroyed a Russian Lada car, and that was on December 18th. Let's see what else is over here, if this is of importance. So here, this is from December 20th. This is just a drone observing 2 Russian soldiers that were walking through the ruins of Nelipivka. This region has now become far more sort of more common to see Russian troops over here, either on foot or in vehicles pushing through. You don't see any localized Ukrainian counterattacks in these regions anymore. So then Russian advances in some cases extended even further northwards into areas like Lenivka. So here, for instance, you have an FPV strike by, I think it was the Predator Police Brigade. They hit a Russian vehicle in Benivka, and possibly this indicates that the Russians are permanently present over here. But I'm going to wait out for additional elaboration, because it isn't too far of a stretch for a vehicle to advance from the forward bounds of the front line and go 1.2 kilometers northwards in a couple of minutes and then get targeted by an FPV, and that could be the end of the story. It doesn't necessarily imply full control in that location, but we're looking at a very narrow area, which is beneficial for the Ukrainians because it means that they can focus all of the resources, if they are limited, which they definitely are in this case, on a singular area, and that sort of reduces the Russian possibilities of success. But despite that fact, just due to the sheer amount of you know volume of assaults, volume of manpower involved, volume of vehicles that can be utilized readily, it does allow the Russians to eventually break through in these particular areas. But this is not the main focus. It hasn't been for a while. The Russians are able to make inroads in the center of Toretsk itself, and that's what's more important at this point, because even if the Russians can't, penetrate deep into Benivka from the south, the Russians are already making very large strides to the east, which will, by a certain period of time in the future, have the potential to flank the village from the east. You can see that over here with my mouse. To zoom in on the Zabalka district, you can see how much of the southern portion has been taken over recently by the Russians. You have this local Terekhan, which is now on the precipice of being taken over by the Russians, and then we give them this sort of local height to overlook this vertical line of defenses that runs from this Terracon all the way to the rail line. This is a very important static line of defense, one of the few in this location. But it would be necessary in order to prevent Russian troops from continuing with their momentum, pushing westwards towards some of the larger medium-sized settlements that the Ukrainians are currently operating on, that act as a conduit between the fighting that is occurring in the center of Toretsk and then connecting them to the wider Ukrainian logistical network in Donetsk, like in Konstantinivka and so on. So it's very important for the Ukrainians to ensure that they hold on to that location. Here you can see December 19th, Predator Police Brigade, their FPV strikes and grenade drops onto the Kulatsky Khutor micro district. That is the district over here. It's now in the process of being taken over by the Russians. A little more than half of it is still under Ukrainian control. And then there's still not enough confirmation that the Russians have taken over this northwestern parts of Zabalka. It's possible, and some Ukrainian sources have talked about it. Some Russian sources claim that the entirety of the Zabalka district is in their hands, but so far I just have not seen any geolocations from this northwestern tip, which I think would suffice. But right now there's just a big question mark about this region. Probably not a lot of activity there. Whereas we're seeing a lot of Russian movement occurring a bit to the north, because in these regions, the Russians have been able to infiltrate past the Dzerzhinsky Street area where they were situated for so long, branch out into the industrial zone at the center of the city, including just a massive industrial plant and nearby electric substation, warehouses, of course, all the swell tips that come along with it, which give just an amazing vantage point to overlook the surrounding areas that are on lower elevation. Look at the elevation situation. It's almost perfect for the Russians nowadays. Now that they've been able to take over all these areas in yellow, you see it. And it's like these regions that are bounded by the red perimeter, they are on way higher elevation in the valley on which the northwestern and just generally northern sections of Toretsk are situated upon. So you can see over here, this is all valley. I suppose that you could say Krymsk is also on a bit of a height, so that's some silver lining for the Ukrainians. But then, besides the fact that this is on a valley, so are all the villages on the Kryvyi Torets River Valley. They are on low elevation. They are being actively monitored and fired upon by Russians located on high ground nearby. That is, of course, a major local advantage. You can see here that the Russians took over 1 square kilometer, and this is in a very dense area where you did see enormous resistance, and continue to see that from the Ukrainian garrison, which is now very experienced, especially from a drone perspective. You have a very disciplined drone element that is very regularly publishing videos targeting Russian soldiers, or sending in these sort of sappers to undermine Russian positions in high-rise apartment buildings. But here you can see December 14th, Voron FPV strike onto Khim Kolonka. That's the name of this district. It's located over here. I'm going over with my cursor. Voron is a part of the 100th Mechanized Brigade, one of the key units involved in defense in this region. And this geolocation indicated an advance of at most 1.3 kilometers northwestwards. In the process, the Russians have taken over also this mall. I don't know if you could call it a mall, but just these convenience stores. And I think it's a baby product store as well. There was a bus station nearby. So just a couple of key areas in the city falling into Russian hands along Mayakovsky streets. Then a bit to the east, you can see that this entire sort of more sparse parts of Toretsk, where it's just private residential areas and gardens and shrubbery. It's 1 square kilometer as well, taken over by the Russian side. This area includes a local school, and generally the Russians have solidified control over the town hall, the city administration building, this local hospital. So a lot of the key structures within the city, including the football stadium, and they've been able to expand their gains further northwards all the way into the micro district of Krimsk. So here you can see December 20th, the Predator Police Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers as they continue with that advance northwards, amounting to a total of 1.3 kilometers as well. And this one is not relevant. You can see Krimsk is one of the, I suppose, final layers of defense when it comes to houses in the way of the Russians before they reach this large span of open fields, which would give them direct access to villages like Dakhnia Delivka. And this is already concerning because it would undermine the Ukrainian frontline positions that have been built meticulously to sort of oppose the Donbass Canal, built sort of adjacent to it for a scenario wherein the Ukrainians lose all their positions east of the canal, which they have now done. They don't have positions over here anymore. So all those units that were located there, they sort of fell back to this line that is very well built with a lot of dugouts and trenches a bit to the southwest. Now, a lot of those areas are going to be threatened from an area that was totally not anticipated, coming in from this open region from the south with the sort of height advantage from both the area east of the canal, but also from the southern Toretsk region. So that's something to keep an eye out for in the future, but not right now immediately. More generally, you also have the Russians looking at taking over the spoil tip in its entirety and then focusing a lot of fire and ground advances at the final portions of Toretsk that have not been taken over yet, because you're looking at areas that are not as difficult as where the next fighting was for a lot of time, which was around the high-rise buildings and the city center. Now you're looking at the northwestern outskirts and areas that really are either duplexes or private residential areas. There are a few local terracons, but nothing that's really is of comparison or of parity to the ones that the Russians are in the process of taking over. So the Russians already have experience clearing out similar sized districts, either in Toretsk itself or on in its eastern suburbs. So that's going to be their focus now. And as they continue advancing in this region, they're going to see themselves pushing forward along the same road, the same paved highway that leads all the way up northwards to Konstantinivka. So this is just the perfect route to reach Konstantinivka from the south, put pressure onto its logistical nodes coming in from the east as well. And now the Russians, if you're measuring it, they're like about 13 kilometers away, so it is still, pretty far away. But once there is a bit of a buffer zone around Toretsk, the Russians could then move in some of their medium-range artillery into the high ground regions in eastern Toretsk and fire into Konstantinivka itself, as they could also do now from the eastern parts or the area just west of Bakhmut towards Konstantinivka. And so I expect that in tandem with the Russian gains and capitalization in Toretsk, there could also be additional movement in Chasiv Yar to sort of complement that and push across two different axes to put pressure onto Konstantinivka. But this is looking more into the medium term. It's not something that's going to happen immediately. Besides Toretsk, the Russians have to, of course, focus on eliminating all the Ukrainian resistance running along the Kryvyi Toretsk River, which would be a thorn in their back if they want to then advance northwards directly into southern Konstantinivka. So that would include all of these possessions over here, all these populated areas and trenches that are, coming along with that. So that's going to be, of course, one of the next Russian priorities following the complete fall of Toretsk. Now, looking at Kursk, you can see the one update from the past 24 hours is in Kuruglenkoy. Russian gains here amount to nearly 7 square kilometers, as reported on based on geolocations and by Petrenko. You can see here as I'm zooming in that there is a geolocation. This is based on a video from the 73rd Marine Center. This unit used to operate very infamously in Kherson, but also around Zaporozhye during the counteroffensive. It's now being redeployed as have a lot of units from the Marine Corps to the Kursk region, and it's involved with the defense here. So they are claiming, and again, this is all claims. I can't confirm it either way. They're saying that they utilized drones dropping grenades and MK-19 grenade launchers to kill 12 North Korean soldiers and wound another 20, and then successfully evacuated their own men during the ground clashes here in this gully that is located north of Kruglenkoy. Of course, they did publish footage of grenade drops onto individual soldiers, but it's not anything definitive. It's just that the Ukrainians have been consistently now in this location, whether it's the 73rd Brigade or the 90, or not brigade, but Operations Center or 95th Air Assault Brigade, or various other units from this location. They've been very adamant about the fact that they're targeting North Korean soldiers. And as we talked about in yesterday's video, they're talking about it in the Blokhovo region and then also in Nechayev. And here now, Kruglenkoy, it appears to be the area where they're talking about it the most. This is also an area where you have the operations of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade and 22nd Motor Rifle Regiment. So those are the units that are pushing the most. And, we're going to have to just wait and see about whether the claim is true. But regardless of who it was specifically, it does show us that the Russian side is advancing in this area, that they've taken over parts of Kruglenkoy, meaning that they are now only, if we're going to measure it, 1.8 kilometers away from Nikolaevka. So this is very important. Now the Russians are beginning to directly fire towards supply lines from Malaya Luknaya all the way to Pogrebki, this region, which is very dense when it comes to the amount of Ukrainian soldiers operating here, a lot of important units defending within a very narrow corridor. The goal is to, of course, buy land and time, focus the Russian efforts on this one particular pocket, instead of then focusing southwards on areas that are more open and would be suitable for deep advances all the way to Suzhou. So really, this is all a part of just creating a buffer zone for Suzhou. And now the Russians are beginning to close in on it from the Kruglenkoy region, in addition to the pushes that have recently come from Naidenov. So it's very important for the Ukrainians to continue to hold the line over here and ensure that they are not compromised, that they are not, almost encircled and developed in a way that will force them out or physically cut them off. That would be the fear. And also, just final thing is that the 5th Tank Brigade is now being relabeled the 5th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, the 3rd unit to do so, because you had the 17th turned into Heavy Mechanized Brigade. It was previously a tank brigade, and then the 117th Mechanized Unit turned into the 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. What I think this means is that there has to be 2 tank battalions, 2 rifle battalions, and 2 mechanized battalions. And that means in this case, there's going to be 1 extra rifle battalion added to this unit. And just sort of like another example would be that the 117th Brigade previously only had 1 tank battalion, and now it's receiving another one. So 2 of each kind. And all of them are being sort of labeled together within that alias. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.